Back in May, I published a video essay explaining why, in my view, Israel was committing genocide against the Palestinian population of Gaza. Since then, the video has gathered considerable attention, and I was even interviewed in the radio about it. But I think what's important is to notice that genocide is a specific typified conduct. It's something that you do with a specific intent. And when that happens, it's important to call it that. And I think from the analysis that me and I think most of the people that study genocide have concluded, Israel has committed the conduct and it has demonstrated expressly the intent to destroy the people of Palestine, of Gaza. So when you add those two, you get genocide. That's basically it. In this video, I want to double down on that claim, that this is an easy, mainstream, and not at all radical conclusion to reach. But I want to do it by looking at what academics have said and what they are saying about it. After all, I am an academic. I move around academic circles. I participate in academic workshops and conferences and panels. I talk about these things with people that have an expertise on it, and frequently. And I see with my very eyes and hear with my very ears what the academic consensus around Gaza is, that Israel is committing genocide. Of course, there is scholarly disagreement. There always is, and that is healthy. But I think even with this disagreement, for reasons that I will explain here, most of the most well-respected experts on genocide would agree with me. And yet, if one looks at the media, this is not the outlook one would see. Journalists and pundits still tiptoe around the concept with extreme care. I want to push back against this and show you, in their words, what academics are saying atop our inaccessible ivory towers and the kinds of debates and ideas the media is not showing you. So let's do this. Let me look into the legal arguments for finding genocide in Gaza one more time, but this time by conducting a literature review of the Gaza Genocide. As is almost tradition by now, let me start with a disclaimer. It is important for me to clarify what my intentions are with this video, especially in light of the discourse surrounding expertise that has been circulating in the media ever since that fateful Dave Smith-Douglas Murray debate on Joe Rogan's podcast.
I'm still slightly bemused about this move from I'm an expert on this and I have views to I'm a comedian.
I've never claimed to be an expert on anything.
This is the problem, Joe. I mean, if somebody
Wait a minute,
says
you have to claim to be an expert on something to have an opinion on something?
No, you don't have to be. You don't have to be. But
So what's
this is
the
like
issue?
I'm not a historian, but I'm pumping out history.
But wait a minute,
I'm
what
not
about
an expert,
just-
but I'm talking all the time about
But
this
you're not
thing.
even talking about specifically on what he just said.
No, I'm saying this is my point about this. You say I'm not an expert.
So what's the solution? To not talk about it?
No, it's to have more experts around.
Well, the expert
To
class
hear-
hasn't done a great job,
I know,
man. This is follow the science.
absolutely,
Yeah, but you know what?
absolutely, I
Okay, so
agree
fine.
with
So
that.
during,
I just said
okay,
to you,
so,
I agree
right,
with that.
Right, I know.
But
so
one of the
Douglas,
problems
during
is-
all of COVID,
Fire away.
I will put my track record against any of the expert class on COVID. I'm glad to do that. So should I have just shut up? Should I have shut up by opposing lockdowns and opposing
No.
vaccine mandates
No.
and
Well,
talking
that
about
was
the
the
lab leak
argument at the
theory?
time. You realize
that's
that,
the
right?
entire argument that you're making. Let the
No,
experts
I'm
handle
not,
this.
I'm not. No.
You're not an expert.
You're
you're right. I was just a
you're
comedian.
wildly not listening to what I'm saying.
Let me be clear here. I do not think academic experts have any kind of special claim over discourse. I don't think it should only be experts who get a right to discuss current events. And I most certainly don't think you need to accept a paid tour of Gaza from the IDF to be allowed to opine on this topic. Quite to the contrary, please don't accept stuff from the IDF. But I also think academics should play a role in shaping discourse. I mean, this is why I created this channel. My problem, therefore, is in the imbalance. We need journalists, activists, pundits, NGOs, and hell, even comedians to have a healthy public discussion. Just think of all the excellent comedic commentary out there, the late shows, etc. But we also need academics, and right now there are no academics in public discourse. The very few ones that are, the ones that are regularly invited to the big media and YouTube channels, they are not very representative of the community. So perhaps let me explain. What do I mean when I say we also need experts in genocide in the discussion? I think the first thing we need to clarify is the outlook of the field or fields involved in the question of genocide in Gaza. After all, how academics arrive at their conclusions is a very relevant question to determine how we are engaging with academia on a specific matter. If I want to discuss evolution and I only invite scholars from theology departments, I will certainly be engaging with academia, but the answers I will get will not be very representative of the consensus around evolution in the field of, say, evolutionary biology. method and specialization matter. These are things those who gatekeep discourse, producers, editors, bookers, they need to be aware of this. Otherwise, they risk simply reinforcing echo chambers. So, to discuss the question of genocide in Gaza, there are a few relevant academic fields we need to look at. So, let's start with the most obvious one. So, the most obvious academic field to review is genocide studies. It is also known as genocide and Holocaust studies, and this will be relevant further down the line. The main thing to know about this field is that it is interdisciplinary by nature. No one studies a degree in genocide. There are no genocidologists in the world. Genocide studies scholars therefore come from several disciplines. Some are historians, others are political scientists, others international lawyers, there's behavioral psychologists. Each will approach genocide from their own perspective. The main thing they have in common, therefore, is not their method, but the field of study. The field, however, is currently experiencing what many describe as a crisis, brought about by the clash between genocide and Holocaust scholars who draw connections in their research with Israel's treatment of Palestinians and those who do not. The key point of contention here is the role of Zionism, seen as either an expression of Jewish resilience in the face of extermination, where criticism equates anti-Semitism, or as an ideology leading Israel to impose exterminationist policies against Palestinians. The main driving force in the wedge between the Zionist and the non-Zionist camp in Holocaust studies is a phenomenon known in the discipline as Holocaust Exceptionalism, the idea that the Holocaust was simply different from any other kind of genocide. So famously, in 1992, Yehuda Bauer, the Jonah N. Machover Professor of Holocaust Studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, objected to even comparing the suffering of Roma and disabled peoples to that of Jewish people during the Holocaust, saying that, quote, the parallel between their case and that of the Jews has not been proved. For Professor Bauer, all Jews were to be killed, but in his words, pure, quote-unquote, Roma, and he used a different term here that I won't repeat, were to be kept alive, that is, only so-called wandering Roma were persecuted, and therefore for Bauer, the Holocaust was only about killing Jews. It was Judeocide, as he called it. As Shira Klein argues, Holocaust exceptionalism lent itself to a sort of Israel exceptionalism, which absolved Israel of any potential wrongdoing. According to this narrative, just as the Holocaust was uniquely terrible, so Israel, the state of Holocaust survivors and representative of the Jewish people, had to be uniquely good and uniquely protected. Israel could only ever be a victim, never a perpetrator, and when criticism arose, it simply had to be anti-Semitism. Take, for instance, Holocaust scholar Daniel Goldhagen, Associate Professor of Government and Social Studies at Harvard. Goldhagen is the author of the famous 1996 book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, which argued the Holocaust was the result of a uniquely German eliminationist anti-Semitic identity. When approaching Israel's relation to Palestinians, Goldhagen has said that, quote, the internet and television's biased stories and inflammatory images of Palestinian suffering were nothing but globalized anti-Semitism. For Goldhagen, the same old Nazi eliminationist anti-Semitism had simply been exported from Europe to the Middle East. With these problematic theoretical assumptions, therefore, many of these Zionist scholars are simply incapable of concluding that Israel can even abstractly commit genocide. And since Israel cannot commit genocide, then Gaza cannot be a genocide. Jewish and Israeli Holocaust scholars are not, however, a monolith. Many have distanced themselves from both the idealization of Zionism and from Holocaust exceptionalism. As Adi Ofer, professor emeritus at Tel Aviv University, complained in 1987, quote, to what lengths Jewish historians, educators, and politicians go to remind us over and over of the difference between the destruction of the Jews of Europe and all other types of disasters, misfortunes, and mass murders. Biafra was only hunger, Cambodia was only a civil war, the destruction of the Kurds was not systemic, death in the Gulag lacked national identification marks, end quote. Famously as well, Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt argued in her classic Origins of Totalitarianism that Israel has colonized and then conquered Palestine, arguing that the establishment of Israel, a nation of refugees, had rather created just another category of refugees, Palestinians. Similarly, John K. Roth, professor of philosophy and Holocaust studies at Claremont McKenna College, argued in 1988 that, quote, Kristallnacht happened because a political state decided to be rid of people unwanted within its borders. It seems increasingly clear that Israel would prefer to rid itself of Palestinians if it could do so. Their presence in Gaza and the West Bank is a liability and a threat to many Israeli intentions. Thus, the voice of Moledet, a radical Israeli party seeking to transfer Palestinians out of the occupied territories, euphemistic and muted though it may be, is not to be taken lightly. This is particularly true when it seems equally clear that not many other nations in the world want the Palestinians either. As much as any other people today, they are being forced into a tragic part too much like the one played by the European Jews 50 years ago. This state of affairs in genocide studies, as a field divided into two equally represented sides, began to change in the 1990s. A swath of new archival documents were made available to researchers in Israel, leading a whole new generation of Israeli historians to reevaluate Israel's foundational myth. Scholars like Ilan Pape and Benny Morris, although Morris has recently recanted his findings, began to argue that Israel had been born out of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, challenging traditional Zionist narratives. This research had a similar impact on genocide and Holocaust studies. The new theoretical frameworks available led to an increase in genocide scholars connecting the Holocaust to other atrocities and understanding their common root causes in terms of structural racism, colonial mindsets, ethnic hatred, etc. Thus, by 2008, when Dan Stone edited his famous book on the historiography of the Holocaust, he noted how one key historiography of the Holocaust now argued that, quote, there are important links between colonial genocide and the Holocaust, as well as meaningful conceptual gains to be made by thinking of the Holocaust in terms of comparative genocide. Thus, for instance, Dirk Moses argued in his 2011 Paranoia and Partnership that the notion that genocide was a Holocaust-type pure hate crime with no political connotations was mistaken. Quote, genocide is mistakenly identified as a massive hate crime based entirely on race, Moses said, when in fact it has a political logic, irrational or at least exaggerated fears about subversion and national ethnic security, end quote. Even in the context of the Holocaust. For many historians, he said, as for the public, the Holocaust is the prototypical genocide, such that mass violence must resemble the Holocaust to constitute genocide. But Moses claims that this view of the genocide as being devoid of political connotations is simply unsustainable. Even the Holocaust was not simply about pure racial hatred. The Nazis, he says, saw so-called international Jewry as a unified political subject, indeed a belligerent one, tied to British and Americans. As he would recount in his later book, The Problems of Genocide, Nazis like Otto Ollendorf justified killing Jewish children on the fact that they would then grow up and constitute a security threat to Germany. They were seen as enemies in an imagined war, not just an inferior race. This comparative trend has continued to the point where by 2018, Israeli scholar Amos Goldberg could edit a book called The Holocaust and the Nakba, a direct connotation between Jewish and Palestinian suffering with genocide. As Klein retells, one article in Goldberg's book by Holocaust scholar Alon Confino centered on a married couple, Holocaust survivors Genia and Henry Kowalski, who were offered a Palestinian home on their arrival in Israel in 1949. Seeing a table still set with plates, evidence that the former residents had fled in terror, the couple decided they could never live there, explaining, it reminded us how we had to leave the house and everything behind when the Germans arrived and threw us into the ghetto, end quote. Thus, as the discipline began distancing itself from Holocaust exceptionalism and its historical closeness to Zionism, it began to appraise genocide as a broader and political concept, not just the pure hatred model of traditional historiographies. Thus, after October 7th, this discipline was very attuned to the colonial nature of the Israeli-Palestinian relation and the ease with which these kinds of relations can devolve into genocidal logics, especially after traumatic events like October the 7th. So when these scholars heard the genocidal rhetoric coming out of Israel's leadership, they did not hesitate to sound the alarm. There was, they warned, a clear risk of genocide. The first genocide scholar to raise the alarm was Ras Siegel, calling it a textbook case of genocide as early as October 13th. A few months later, in fact, in an article co-authored with Italian scholar Luigi Danieli, Siegel made the argument that the genocide threshold had been crossed even before October 7th, noting how exterminationist rhetoric and actions, particularly in the West Bank, had been common in Israel's government since months before the attack. Siegel and Danieli made the clear distinction that Holocaust scholars, Holocaust and period scholars, had failed the test of history and even managed to justify Israel's actions. On the other hand, they argued Holocaust and genocide scholars were focusing, quote, on Israel's extremely violent attack on Gaza, including the possibility of genocide. This divide seems very real. Michael Berenbaum, distinguished professor at the American Jewish University and representative of what Siegel and Danieli call the Holocaust-only school, did not just defend Israel's actions in Gaza, but made reference to Palestinian birth rates to deny a potential genocide.
Israel is not committing genocide. I know a little bit about genocide. I've only studied it for the bulk of my professional life. And let me give you a couple of ways to respond to that. Israel has the power to commit genocide. It has the provocation to commit genocide. It has deliberately never committed genocide in this. And the evidence of that is a couple of fold that you hear time and again. Number one, population in the West Bank is increasing significantly, reproducing and increasing in numbers. The population in Gaza is increasing and reproducing in numbers. And notice what they say, that more than 1 in 2, more than 50%, some even use the statistic, 60% of the population are children. In cases in which a society is the victim of genocide or about to be the victim of genocide, there's a deterioration, there's a dramatic drop in the birth rate because parents don't dare to bring children into such a world. And that's material evidence that genocide is not being committed.
On November 17, 150 Holocaust scholars issued a statement blaming Hamas for Israel's actions and denouncing rising anti-Semitism. To this side of the discipline, charging Israel with genocide was, quote, inflammatory and dangerous. But given the changes in the discipline I described before, most, if not all, scholars writing outside the framework of ideological Zionism have now concluded that Israel is in fact committing genocide. On November 10, Israeli scholar Omer Bartov argued in the New York Times that war crimes and even crimes against humanity are happening, and that there is genocidal intent which can easily tip into genocidal action. Since then, Bartov has concluded that Israel's actions are genocidal.
The case that I made in the article and that I've been making for a while is that at the beginning, immediately after October 7th, the Hamas attack on October 7th, Israeli political and military leaders made a series of pronouncements which could be interpreted as calling for genocide. But there was still at that point, there was no evidence that this was being implemented. Over time, and I would say by May of 2024, it became apparent that these statements were not only made in the heat of the moment following the massacre by Hamas, but were actually being implemented in a manner that would make it impossible for people to live in Gaza, make the entire Gaza Strip uninhabitable and make life there impossible, as well as destroy all the institutions that would be there for that group to reconstitute itself as a social, cultural, political group once the violence was over. Of course, it's not over yet. I started thinking that in May, in August that year, I wrote an article that explained that. But the violence has only continued, and the attempt, as you just reported, to destroy Gaza entirely has continued since. And it is now clear that Israel is trying to concentrate the population of Gaza in the southernmost parts of the Strip, to enclose them, and to enforce eventually either that they would just die out there or that they would be removed from the Gaza Strip altogether.
For Bartov, in fact, there were similarities between the IDF and Nazi soldiers, quote, having internalized certain views of the enemy, the Bolsheviks as untermenschen, Hamas as human animals, and of the wider population as less than human and undeserving of rights. Soldiers observing or perpetrating atrocities tend to ascribe them not to their own military or to themselves, but to the enemy. Amos Goldberg, another Israeli scholar, wrote an article called Yes, This is Genocide. There he argued, quote, genocide is the deliberate destruction of a collective or part of it, and this is what is happening in Gaza. The result is undoubtedly genocidal. 55 of these scholars eventually released their own statement on 9th December 2023. Quote, "We, scholars of the Holocaust, genocide, and mass violence, feel compelled to warn of the danger of genocide in Israel's attack on Gaza," they said. Since then, the number of prominent genocide experts that have determined that Israel is committing genocide has only increased. Martin Shaw, who literally wrote the book entitled "What is Genocide?", gave a presentation at a seminar where he gave his reasons in detail.
But it was clear in October 2023 that what was happening now was a new stage, a very radical new stage in this process. That because of the nature of the humiliation inflicted on Israel and on its leaders, a humiliation which echoed other humiliations of political leaders, which will always lead to enormous overreactions. And because of the historic pattern in which we can see from the history of colonial conquest that when the colonized use violence against the colonizers, there is always a big overreaction. And so when there are massacres of the colonizers, there are usually full-scale genocides or very large massacres of the colonized. And this pattern, all of this made me think that what we were going to see, or what we were seeing even in the first 24 hours after October 7th, was the beginnings of a genocide. And this was confirmed really by the enormous bombardment which Israel undertook in the first weeks. It was quite clear that they were attempting to destroy Gaza in total, in general, not just a little bit here or a little bit there, or one neighborhood here, one neighborhood there. They were attempting to destroy the whole place, and they were immediately forcing the people of Gaza out of their homes and into smaller and smaller parts of the territory. So it was evident that we were seeing not just war crimes, not even just crimes against humanity, but the intentional destruction of Palestinian society in Gaza. And that is why I call it a genocide, because genocide is the intentional destruction of a group or a community, a society. And that is what we were seeing even in October 2023 and what we have seen in the subsequent 20 months.
In fact, he made the explicit connection between the kind of policies described by Raphael Lemkin himself, the creator of the term genocide, and Israel's policies in Gaza.
And I think in terms of the founder of the idea of genocide, Raphael Lemkin, who talked about genocide as either the destruction or the crippling of a society. And the way in which he talked about genocide that the Nazis committed in the 1940s has very much echoes in the genocide that we see today in Gaza. So Lemkin talked about the extreme weakening of the conditions of life so that, quote, "a daily fight literally for bread and for physical survival would handicap thinking in both general and national terms." So he was linking really the way in which the physical conditions of the people were diminished to the point of virtually nothing, and when they were fighting for bread and being shot down when they were getting it, with the crippling of the idea of the possibility of a national movement and national solutions to their problems. And this seems to me to very much be echoed in what we see today.
Similarly, Dirk Moses, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Genocide Research, the leading journal in the field, concluded similarly that Israel is committing genocide.
My point is that the rules are biased against you because they buy into the artificial and misleading binary between war and genocide. Rather than engage in the yes or no calculus that the law of genocide demands, the novel nature of the Israeli campaign can call for rethinking of this artificial binary between war and genocide. Because this war we're seeing today fuses their logics in various ways that international courts could register in reconsidering how they deduce mens rea, this mental state of intention of genocide. One aspect is the Israeli military using the AI technology called Lavender that identified 37,000 male targets in Gaza very soon after 7th of October. Now, the human operators spent 20 seconds per target to verify that they're male, because I said women can't be, by definition, in Hamas. And the settings allowed for 15 to 20 civilian deaths for low-level targets. But they were then killed with 2,000 dumb bombs that flattened entire buildings with the occupants inside, which vastly exceeded this ratio of 1 to 25 or 1 to 20. Because another software, which was called Where's Daddy, extremely cynical name, determined when the targets entered their homes, where the IDF preferred to bomb them, meaning that entire buildings with their female and child inhabitants, civilian inhabitants, were killed along with their target. Now, leaving aside the cavalier and imprecise manner in which these targets were determined, this practice puts paid to the stock defense of the high casualty rate, namely that they were human shields caused by Hamas hiding among civilians and making them therefore military targets. In fact, military operators waited until their targets were among civilians to launch the ordnance. These civilian deaths were not incidental. They were quite deliberate and cumulatively result in, if you like, genocidal outcomes, even if the legal nature of the term doesn't capture that. So what you have is this messy fusion of military and genocidal logics. And it's also evidence in the siege starvation of Gaza. Whereas the UN officials and academics have been warning about genocidal famine in Gaza for months, Israeli officials, their Western supporters, and the Israeli ad hoc judge at the ICJ, Aaron Barak, disavow a genocidal intention by insisting on the military context and its tragic byproducts. Meanwhile, senior Israeli figures claim the siege is not intended to starve the population, but to induce Hamas to end its resistance and release the Israeli hostages, as well as to induce the population to leave. You recall one of them said, once disease breaks out and it affects the children of Hamas, then they'll cough up the hostages. Combined with statements about making Gaza uninhabitable, the effects on the Palestinian population in no way really can be seen to be incidental. They are intended. They are genocidal in effect, and their vehicle, though, is military necessity. Again, the military and genocidal logics are fused and commingled. Finally, there is a cynical use of humanitarian rhetoric about safe zones and passages, ostensibly to remove civilians from combat zones, but only to kill them en route, as well as aid workers through bombings. On the grounds, putatively, that Palestinian Hamas figures may be lurking there. I mean, it's always alleged, it's never proven, but it's alleged. Francesca Albanese calls this last practice, humanitarian camouflage. Cumulatively, these ostensibly legal and humanitarian gestures are having a genocidal effect. Taken with statements from Israeli leaders to depopulate northern Gaza, along with the destruction of schools, universities, mosques, hospitals, agricultural land, as well as buildings in general, whose rubble could take, till 2040 or 2050 to remove, it's impossible to avoid the conclusion that the effect, if not the point, of the military action is not solely to destroy Hamas, as claimed, but also the possibility of Palestinian life in Gaza.
Likewise, Melanie O'Brien, the president of the Genocide Studies Association, arrived at the same conclusion.
Applying international law as it exists today, that is the definition of genocide that we find in the Genocide Convention and we find in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, I would determine that what is happening at the moment in Gaza constitutes genocide. That definition is a list of crimes committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a group of people, either national, racial, ethnic, or religious. And those crimes include crimes of killing or imposing conditions designed to bring about the physical destruction of life. And at the moment, what we can see going on fits well within that legal definition of genocide. First of all, we need to look at the idea of intent that comes with the definition of genocide, this what we call a special intent, and that is the intent to destroy the group. And that is one of the hardest things to prove in a courtroom, and why people often ask about, how do we prove that? So how do we prove that special intent in a courtroom? One of the most obvious ways is through direct statements made by political and military leaders or other prominent members in a community, and we do see that here. We have seen that since very early on, immediately after the 7th of October. Statements made by Israeli political and military leadership concerning the destruction of Palestine, the destruction of the Palestinian people, the starvation of the Palestinian people. So very overt statements of intent. We can also prove that intent through looking at a pattern of conduct. And so what we do is we take that pattern, not just from the 8th of October, but from prior to that, for the many years before that, and we look at what has been going on. But if we think about what we would look at since the 7th of October, we would be talking about mass casualties, huge numbers of deaths, tens of thousands of deaths committed through indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, injuries, so causing serious bodily or mental harm. But even going beyond that, we're looking at the destruction of healthcare facilities. So Palestinians in Gaza cannot access healthcare. We are looking at the destruction of essential infrastructure like electricity and water plants. So people in Palestine have no power, they cannot access water. We are looking at the restriction on humanitarian aid, which in this case covers food, water, and healthcare, things like medicines. So without access to this is what we would say is the genocidal crime of imposing conditions of life designed to bring about physical destruction. Because if you are denying people water, shelter, healthcare, and food, the outcome is inevitable. And we've seen that in past genocides. This kind of conduct is actually essential to the genocide process, in particular the denial of food and water. And what it creates is an obvious situation. What else are you trying to do if you deny people food other than starve them to death?
In short, therefore, at least in the field of genocide studies, there is a clear divide between those whose underlying assumptions about genocide remain associated to Zionism and Holocaust exceptionality, and who therefore simply cannot methodologically conclude that Israel is even abstractly capable of committing genocide, and those whose underlying assumptions are premised on comparative and historical political analysis. How you evaluate the consensus view in genocide studies, therefore, will depend on how much you think Zionism and Holocaust exceptionality are distorting the analysis and leading to biased outcomes. Whether you see the genocide/Holocaust studies divide as one where genocide scholars have corrupted a discipline that should be tied to Israel on principle, or if you see them as freeing the discipline from historical and ideological constraints. I see it as the latter. I don't think it is reasonable to not take into account these scholars' methodological connection to Zionism in the evaluation of who gets to call Gaza a genocide. In other words, the consensus of the discipline of genocide studies is that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. The other logical place to look for scholarly output on the Gaza genocide is the field of international law. In very simplistic terms, international law studies the rules that regulate international behavior. Historically, these rules have been closely aligned with the defense of colonialism. It is only relatively recently that rules regarding accountability for atrocity crimes have been incorporated into international law. Think, for example, the Nuremberg trial. For our purposes, there are two relevant and interconnected branches of international law worth looking into. International humanitarian law, the law that regulates the conduct of hostilities in armed conflict, and international criminal law, the law that typifies and criminalizes specific international crimes. In other words, one tells the states how to fight, the other one punishes individuals for violating these rules. The fact that each of these focuses on different aspects of war is relevant, though. International criminal lawyers tend to be more concerned with accountability and focus more on procedural aspects. So not just whether a war crime was committed, but how would the court come about to have jurisdiction, or what procedures should be followed once the accused surrenders to the court. Scholars of international humanitarian law are more varied and arguably sometimes less concerned with the actual procedure of accountability. Of course, these two worlds frequently overlap. People who study IHL will also know ICL and vice versa. But some folks often build more reputations in one or another field. IHL is usually split into two big traditions, the military or humanitarianism. I'll be honest, this is a separation that feels very artificial to me, as it essentializes the military to basically mean the military cultures of NATO allied states, particularly the US and Israel, which is not very representative of broader positions in every military in the world, particularly in the global south. But breaking down this binary might be a bit too much to ask for this already long video, so let me adopt it for practical purposes, with the important proviso that it is a problematic and Eurocentric one. So to understand this notion of the military culture and its opposition to the humanitarian one, we need to understand that for centuries, the regulation of combat was a matter of chivalry codes and gentleman's honor. It was the province of men-at-arms. But as of the 19th century, with the advent of scientificism and positivism, lawyers began to regulate and systematize the so-called laws of war. One tradition, so the tale goes, was army-led. This was, for example, the case with the Lieber Code, approved by the Lincoln administration in the US as a way to determine what could the Union Army, and implicitly the Confederate Army, do in the US Civil War. This code, therefore, was a tool of war. It was meant to enable the defense of the Union, not elicit a more humane type of war. As Lieber himself wrote down in his code, sharp wars are brief. He meant by this that the most humane thing an army could do in war was to be merciless and brutal and as determined as possible, because that way the war would be over faster. There was no such thing as a humane war in Lieber's mind, only a short one. This tradition was built on the principle of military necessity. In this tradition, the main question one needs to ask oneself when pondering what is legal and what is not is whether the action at hand is necessary for the defeat of one's enemies. If yes, it was legal. If not, if the violence was effected for selfish revenge or for the pleasure of torturing an enemy, it was illegal. But think about it. Everything other than malicious hatred was legal. Bombing a civilian home could be legal if it was militarily necessary. At around the same time as Lieber, though, another famous person was also thinking about war a lot. Henri Dunant, a Swiss merchant, had come across the battlefield of Solferino and was horrified to see corpses rotting in the sun and wounded soldiers being left to die untreated in pain. He thus made it his life's mission to create the first humanitarian organization for time of war, the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thus, unlike Lieber, or again, so the tale goes, Dunant's sole objective was the humanization of war. There's a lot more to say about this humanization process and its many, many inconsistencies and racialized caveats. I mean, I wrote my PhD about this, but for sake of this short introduction, let's just leave it at that. This law was not a tool of war. It was meant to, quote, save people. It did not care about military necessity so much as humanity. It didn't enable the Union to fight the Confederates so much as it restricted what the armies could do with regards to the wounded and detained. Both of these branches led their own paths throughout the 19th and 20th century, assuming the names of the cities where their foundational treaties were negotiated. Thus, the military side was eventually called the Hague Law, while the humanitarian side was eventually called the Geneva Law. Nowadays, though, through processes that are difficult to explain here, like seriously, just read my PhD thesis, both sets of laws have coalesced into one single thing we now call international humanitarian law. But the schools of thought that inspired each half of this discipline continue to see the war differently and focus their attention on different things. Is IHL permissive, meaning that it authorizes states to fight? Or is it restrictive, meaning that it does not authorize anyone to fight, it simply tells states what they cannot do? An IHL scholar from the military tradition will most likely say it is permissive. An IHL scholar from the humanitarian tradition will most likely say it is prohibitive. IHL is therefore a somewhat divided discipline, where US and Israeli military lawyers tend to feel those touchy-feely humanitarians don't get how war works, and where the humanitarians tend to see the military lawyers as vestiges of a different time where human rights simply did not apply or didn't even exist at all. Thus, just like it is useful to ask whether you are listening to a Holocaust scholar or a genocide and Holocaust scholar, it is equally important to ask yourself, who are you talking to? An international criminal lawyer, a military tradition IHL scholar, or a humanitarian tradition IHL scholar? Answers and approaches will vary. The main theoretical discussion when it comes to the law of genocide revolves around the notion of intent. Can you conclude that Israel is acting with intent to destroy Palestinians as a group? In international criminal law, international courts have established that whenever that intent is not expressly stated, it can be deduced from patterns of conduct, so long as genocidal intent is the only reasonable inference from said pattern of conduct. Thus, scholarly debates among lawyers will center on whether they believe that express intent exists, or, if they don't, on whether the intent to destroy can be inferred from Israel's conduct. Generally speaking, those in the military tradition tend to see mass loss of life, particularly in the Global South, as more acceptable collateral damage than those in the humanitarian tradition. They will therefore be more likely to conclude that winning the war is a more reasonable inference than destroying the group. Lawyers are cautious by nature. It is very difficult to get concrete things out of them, or us. It is often the case that lawyers will speak in qualified language just so we will not preempt judicial determinations. This is why you will often hear in the media people talk about the alleged crime or how this or that thing is likely or very likely a crime. Lawyers like to be sure before they speak because often many believe that they don't shape reality. Courts do. Is something a genocide? Well, a lawyer might think so, but if the court says no, then the lawyer was wrong. This is an expression of the profession's formalism. So yeah, lawyers are cautious creatures. When a lawyer tells you this is genocide, it is not something to be taken lightly. It is because of this that it is already remarkable that on October 15th, 2023, 800 scholars and practitioners of international law, conflict studies, and genocide studies signed a public statement, quote, sounding the alarm about the possibility of the crime of genocide being perpetrated by Israeli forces against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Note, of course, that they did not say that there was a genocide. They said that there was a risk of genocide. Given this generally cautious nature, it is not surprising that the first to raise the alarm about an actually occurring genocide, not the risk of one, were Palestinian scholars. People know when they are being genocided. Thus, in November 2023, Shawan Jabaring and Ahmed Abu Ful were the first to tie Israel's genocidal statements to a legal determination of genocidal intent and therefore an actual ongoing genocide. On May 9, 2024, Nimr Sultani, a professor of international law at SOAS in London and editor-in-chief of the Palestine Yearbook of International Law, wrote an article in the Journal of Genocide Studies entitled A Threshold Crossed on Genocidal Intent and the Duty to Prevent Genocide in Palestine. This article is an important one, as it is one of the first peer-reviewed articles written by a Palestinian that makes a detailed argument about intent. Sultani makes the argument that express intent exists and so no inference from conduct is needed. And yet he notes how this is not how the discussion had been framed until then. Instead, much of the mainstream commentary in the months that followed October 7th portrayed the eventual destruction of most of Gaza as an incidental outcome of urban warfare rather than the predictable outcome of a policy. Sultani seeks to disassemble this narrative, arguing that the military logic of highly permissive interpretations of international humanitarian law ultimately conceals genocidal acts and intentions and ignores the context of occupation and apartheid in which Israel's conduct unfolds. Thus, Sultani concludes that the frame of genocide should not be dismissed because of an alleged coexistence of military and genocidal logics, because the invocation of military logic functions to obscure the genocidal logic. Similarly, Palestinian scholar Mohammed Nijim published an article in the Journal of Critical Sociology on October 8, 2024, arguing for a comprehensive understanding of the genocide in Gaza, not as just the immediate result of post-October 7th obliteration, but a longer settler colonial project. But Palestinian scholars were not alone in this endeavor. A small yet proud group of Global North scholars also rose the early warnings that Gaza was not just at risk of genocide, but undergoing one. So on April 17, 2024, Jessica White, a well-respected critical legal philosopher at the University of New South Wales in Australia, wrote an article in the Journal of Genocide Research where she also grappled with the problem of justifications of genocide in the form of exceedingly broad interpretations of IHL. In her words, quote, in attempting to portray its conduct in Gaza as lawful, Israel has attempted to construe the starvation of civilians during war as the tragic incidental cost of necessary military action against combatants. For White, this is a very worrisome development. Quote, Israel's conduct in Gaza and the US's active legal support of it forces us to grapple with the seemingly unthinkable, a perfectly legal genocide that is a genocide legitimized via a permissive interpretation of IHL. She therefore rejects this as an unacceptable conclusion, relying on the history of IHL during the struggles for decolonization in order to argue such a line of thinking contradicts the very object of IHL. On the contrary, it is the deployment of this total war that shows the genocidal intent, regardless of how much its supporters want to claim it is just a war. She concludes examining claims that the so-called general's plan did not evidence intent, but just the tragedy of war. She says, quote, in his disavowal of intent, we see the extreme form of an argumentative strategy that views the destruction of peoples and whole worlds as incidental to military necessities. In other words, White and Sultani both agree you can't hide a genocide behind a war if that war is exterminating a population. Around the same time, on April 9, 2024, Nicola Perugini, senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Edinburgh with expertise in humanitarian law, and Niamh Gordon, professor of human rights law at Queen Mary University London, wrote an article in the Journal of Palestine Studies on Israel's history of targeting Palestinian healthcare infrastructure. They were writing this before October 7th, but Israel's retaliatory campaign started just before they submitted their final manuscript. So during the final edits, they added a paragraph. They wrote, quote, "As we were finalizing this article, the fifth assault on Gaza in 15 years erupted on October 7, 2023, following Hamas and other Palestinian factions' massacre in Israel kibbutzim, towns, military bases, and a musical festival in the desert. Several Israeli high-ranking officials proclaimed their intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the Palestinian population in Gaza, framing them as human animals, promising to turn Gaza into Dresden, and to erase and flatten it. On October 13, Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, stated publicly that there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. Since then, the Israeli military has been engaging in genocidal forms of violent retribution, carpet bombing entire neighborhoods and killing more than 30,000 Palestinians at time of writing, of whom over 12,000 are children. The extent of so much killing in such a short period of time is unprecedented in the 21st century and is accompanied by Israel's repeated dehumanization of Palestinians, the displacement of 1.8 million residents, the cutting off of water, electricity, and fuel from the population of Gaza, the implementation of a policy of starvation, and systematic attacks on dozens of healthcare facilities." End quote. On May 6, Mariam Jamshidi, associate professor of law at the University of Colorado, authored another article in the Journal of Genocide Research where she framed the discussion of genocide in the longer history of settler colonialism, arguing, quote, "For many Palestinians and others, Israel's actions in Gaza since 7 October are the culmination of this historical trajectory rooted both in the structural dimension of Israeli settler colonialism as well as genocidal Zionist policies that predated the State of Israel. While not necessarily genocidal, settler colonialism has an inherently eliminationist logic and is an indicator of genocide. Through its desire to eliminate the native presence on land, settler colonialism creates the conditions in which genocide can occur. In Israel, the settler colonial desire to eliminate the Palestinians is further exacerbated by the long-standing Zionist belief that a large Palestinian population poses an existential threat to the Jewish state. Given the current demographic parity between Israeli Jewish and Palestinian Arab populations stretching from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, the conditions were ripe for Israel to commit genocide against the Palestinians by the time 7th October rolled around. Jamshidi was clear that the hurdles for proving genocide at the ICJ were high, but argued that there were reasons to believe South Africa could overcome these challenges and succeed at the merits stage. She thus lists 1. The countless genocidal statements made by high-ranking Israeli officials, 2. The volume of publicly available direct evidence of Israel's actions inside Gaza. 3. Existing and only increasing expert commentary analyzing genocide accusations against Israel, including from the UN and UN-affiliated persons. 4. The high civilian casualty count and mass starvation happening in Gaza as a result of Israel's actions. 5. The mass forced displacement and ethnic cleansing committed by Israel in Gaza. 6. The long-standing pattern of Israeli conduct towards Palestinians generally and in Gaza particularly contributing to an inference of genocidal intent since October 7th. 7. The possibility that the ICJ's case law on genocide may become more victim-friendly before South Africa's case is decided. And 8. The relative weaknesses of Israel's counter-arguments to South Africa's genocide claim. Thus, by spring of 2024, the Northern Hemisphere spring, there was already a large contingent of legal experts, both Palestinian and non-Palestinians, arriving at the legal conclusion that Israel was committing genocide. And mind you, this is not counting the scholars who acted within civil society and international organizations, such as Agnes Callamard, heading Amnesty International, and Francesca Albanese at the UN, who also concluded that Israel was committing genocide in 2024. And yet, of course, this was not the only point of view. While the emerging consensus was clear that Israel was or might be at risk of committing genocide, some scholars, mostly of the so-called military tradition, were arriving at the opposite conclusion. Thus, on January 11, 2024, so 15 days before the ICJ delivered its first order for provisional measures, Jeffrey Korn, the George R. Killian Jr. Chair of Criminal Law and Director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University, and retired Lieutenant Colonel of the U.S. Army, where he served as a legal advisor, was interviewed by the American Jewish Committee about South Africa's application before the ICJ. Professor Korn referred to South Africa's application as an exercise in selective fact assertion and ignoring inconvenient facts. For Korn, the ICJ case was actually part of Hamas's strategy to get the international community to stop Israel out of a sense of solidarity with Palestinian suffering before it could achieve its objective of, quote, destroying Hamas. To quote Professor Korn verbatim, quote, "So this is all connected to a strategic objective of Hamas, and that's why the most prominent statistic that we hear day in and day out is what? The civilian death toll in Gaza, which ironically never apparently includes an enemy combatant. I guess the IDF is fighting shadows because apparently they're not killing any enemy because every casualty is asserted to be a civilian." And I don't want to in any way minimize the tragedy of human loss in war, but you cannot find an enemy that's determined to create conditions where you have to inflict civilian casualties without doing so, he says. And that's the strategy from inception that has snowballed into a public perception that Israel's objective is much more nefarious than simply defeating Hamas. That's one factor. The other factor, to be candid, is the terribly bombastic statements of certain Israeli government officials that fuel this perception that you have an ulterior motive here that's separate from just achieving a legitimate military goal and the failure of the Netanyahu administration to be more aggressive in sanctioning or isolating the officials in the government who make those foolish statements. End quote. Korn therefore completely separated the reality of the so-called bombastic, genocidal statements by Israeli leaders and the military operation as a whole. Which is, to say the least, a very incomplete analysis. These statements exist and they were never punished. What role do they play? Professor Korn just never tells us. It's all just perception. Korn instead simply assumes that Israel is conducting very precise and very calculated strikes that can be all individually declared legal through a proportionality analysis. So, no genocide. Of course, this is not what Israel did, as reports of targeting through poorly vetted AI and the establishment of invisible kill zones, as well as the reality of starving millions of people, clearly demonstrated. Korn simply never factored this in. It was all discrete and legal individual strikes, no matter what the evidence suggested. Another military lawyer very active during this time was John Spencer, retired major in the US Army and chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. By November 7, 2023, Spencer was already defending Israeli actions in Gaza. In a CNN article, he said, quote, "Nothing I have seen shows that the Israeli Defense Forces are not following the laws of war in Gaza, particularly when the charges that the IDF is committing war crimes so often come too quickly for there to have been an examination of the factors that determine whether an attack and the resultant civilian casualties are lawful." This is a similar argument to Korn. Each individual strike was, or actually had to be, legal under IHL. But he offered no analysis of concrete examples and how they met the legal standard he laid out. Israel, he simply noted, had, quote, pledged to comply with international law. On April 29, he wrote an article on Twitter, now X, arguing that Israel's actions could not be genocide because they did not meet the threshold of special intent. Quote, "The IDF issues evacuation warnings, facilitates humanitarian aid, and restricts military operations to lawful targets. There is no Israeli policy, order, or pattern of action that suggests an attempt to destroy the Palestinian people," he said. But again, no concrete examples, no analysis of the kill zones the Palestinians shot while waving white flags, the shady AI, etc. Of course, Spencer bases these claims from what he calls his own, quote, observations on the ground, that is, the sanitized tours of Gaza he's accepted from the IDF. On November 5, Spencer wrote an article for Newsweek challenging Amnesty International's classification of Gaza as a genocide. The article was frankly a bit embarrassing. It quoted the CIA World Factbook to make the claim that there could be no genocide because the population in Gaza has, quote, increased 2% in the last year. First of all, genocide does not require population decrease. As is clear from the definition, genocide can happen without a single death. If you transfer children from one group to another, for instance, and no one dies, genocide is still configured. Same with subjecting a population to conditions of life calculated to destroy the group. No one actually needs to die. You just have to be trying to get them to be destroyed. But the most embarrassing part is that, as should be logical to anyone paying attention, nobody has gone into Gaza to conduct a population census during Israel's genocide. The CIA's data was rather an estimate based on pre-October 7th data. I guess Mehdi Hassan had a point.
John's not an expert on genocide.
But military lawyers have not been the only ones arguing against a finding of genocide. On November 9, 2023, Stefan Thalmann, professor of international law at the University of Bonn, wrote an article in the German press arguing that, quote, "The IDF most probably commits war crimes in Gaza, but there is no genocide. One should not misconstrue statements by Israeli officials and should not use the statements of a lunatic fringe minister to construe an intent to destroy." Similarly, and contrary to the findings of Palestinian scholars, on a Twitter post on December 5th, Thalmann pushed back on Amnesty's genocide report by stating that the existence of a conflict precluded the existence of a genocide. In his words, quote, "According to the ICJ's established jurisprudence in case of state responsibility, intent to destroy must be the only reasonable inference which can be drawn from a pattern of conduct. The requirement of the only reasonable inference excludes other possible inferences and, in particular, dual intent. Amnesty International is thus wrong to state that the state can have additional goals and purposes as long as it is clear and is the only reasonable inference that the state also has the intent to destroy. If there are several explanations for a certain conduct," he says, "genocidal intent is not the only reasonable inference and that can be drawn from that conduct." Talmon's view would be akin to the Holocaust Exceptionalism view I discussed in the context of Genocide Studies. If it does not look like Nazi-like pure hatred, systematic extermination, and nothing else, it can't be genocide. There's one thing you should know about him, though, in full disclosure. Professor Talmon is one of Myanmar's lawyers at the ICJ. In that case, the Gambia accuses Myanmar of committing genocide against the Rohingya population. Myanmar claims that it may have committed violations of IHL or human rights, but that these do not amount to genocide. Professor Talmon is not advising Myanmar on the specifics of the definition of genocide, but on a more formal issue of standing. Alas, the narrow definition of genocide, like the one he defends for Gaza, would be the most convenient one for his client. I will let you reach your own conclusions about this. Now, in January 2, 2024, two Israeli IHL scholars, Amichai Cohen, professor of law at Ono Academic College, and Yuval Shani, the Hirsch Lauderpacht chair in international law and former dean of the law faculty of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, wrote an article for the international law blog Just Security criticizing South Africa's ICJ case. They identify what they call a tendency to engage in factual cherry-picking and to ignore inconvenient facts when engaging in legal analysis of complex facts, making the claim that the problem is not definitional but factual. Thus, they claim that, quote, proponents of the Israeli genocide claim before the ICJ must therefore contend as a legal matter with counterfacts which put into question the existence of a consistent pattern. Cohen and Shani then list three sets of facts they believe supporters of a genocide can't explain. 1. The extent to which a host of measures taken by Israel to minimize civilian casualties are consistent with the existence of genocidal intent, such as extensive use of early warnings and measures to facilitate greater access to humanitarian provisions, such as the opening of the Kerem Shalom crossing. In other words, this is the there's no intent because this is a normal war argument that Korn and Spencer insist so much on. 2. Whether tactical or strategic reasons other than intent to destroy the Palestinian people as such as military necessity, force protection, or deterrence, can be plausibly inferred from the attacks made and measures taken, even if the weight given to these considerations by Israel exceeds what international law allows, and even if they violate international law prohibitions limiting the use of force or means and methods of warfare or illegal or advance illegal purposes other than genocide. This is the Hamas uses human shields argument. And 3, given Israel's capacity to inflict much more harm to civilians in Gaza than it has done, whether the military campaign cannot be more plausibly explained as one that is directed against Hamas, as was articulated repeatedly by Israeli senior leaders, than one that is directed against the Palestinian people of Gaza. This is the if Israel wanted to commit genocide, it would have argument. I'll be honest, I don't think these are difficult to refute, and for reasons that will become apparent later in the video, I don't really need to spend much time discussing them. So let me say this briefly. 1. On lack of intent, I think the starvation campaign did away with this supposition. Not to mention that Cohen and Shani don't really give sufficient relevance to Israel's genocidal statements. 2. Hamas hides behind human shields is not a good argument once we know about the AI software, the killing zones, the controlled explosions, and the destruction of residences. None of this fits a regular armed conflict paradigm or military necessity. 3. Yes, if Israel wanted to commit genocide, it would obliterate Gaza. Yeah, exactly, it would. As time went by, though, more and more scholars came out to argue that what Israel is doing is indeed genocide, or at least that it is more likely genocide than not. Since more or less spring 2025, the Overton window of genocide has kept on opening. Where it used to be difficult, even potentially costly in personal and professional terms, to say this is genocide in 2024, 2025 has seen this discussion almost normalized in academic circles. Thus, for example, Professor William Shabas, one of the most well-respected scholars of the international law of genocide, and interestingly also a former lawyer for Myanmar, argued on April 2025 that South Africa's case at the ICJ was the strongest case in the court's docket.
These are all variables. If you were a betting shop in London and you asked me to say what are the odds on South Africa, I would have to factor in all those elements in giving you a percentage of their chance of success. But right now, I think of all the cases that have come before the International Court of Justice dealing with the Genocide Convention, there are now 19 of them. South Africa's case is the strongest.
Since then, Shabas has got even more categorical.
Yes, what we've seen over the past year, I would say, more than a year, is a shifting of opinion amongst experts on genocide, amongst political figures, journalists, and so on, understanding what's going on in Gaza now as being what has been called the crime of crimes, genocide. The definition is well known. It's been applied strictly by courts in the past, but even with the strict interpretation of the Genocide Convention, the evidence is all there now, and there's a groundswell of opinion that's building to recognize that this is in fact genocide under international law.
Similarly, Kai Ambos, professor of criminal international law at the University of Göttingen, and Stephanie Bock, professor and director of International Research and Documentation Center for War Crimes Trials at the University of Marburg, wrote an article on 4 June 2025 where they argued that by now Gaza was more likely a genocide than not. In their own words, quote, even though the genocide claim should therefore be treated with caution, especially given the legitimate Israeli security concerns, the evidence for genocide has nonetheless become more compelling in recent days and weeks. The longer the military operation and the accompanying suffering of the civilian population continue, the weaker the link to the Hamas terror attack, which after all took place over 19 months ago, and thus to Israel's right to self-defense becomes. No reasonable observer can deny that Israel's warfare is extremely brutal and disproportionate. Ambos and Bock also find intent in the plans laid out by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich to conclude a so-called humanitarian city, or as I call it, a ghetto, in Gaza. This, coming from German academia, where criticism of Israel remains taboo, is remarkable. In fact, staying in Germany, on July 16, 2025, Der Spiegel interviewed 4 international law experts: Itamar Mann, professor of international law at the University of Haifa; Janina Dill, professor of global security at the Blavatnik School of Government of the University of Oxford; and Stefan Talmon and Kai Ambos, who I've already mentioned. 3 of the 4, Mann, Dill, and Ambos, were clear that in their view, Israel was likely committing genocide. Mann said that he was becoming increasingly convinced Israel was committing genocide. Ambos noted a gradual process of conversion where, at some point, he says, you have to say it all amounts to the destruction of the Palestinians as a group. Dill, for her part, said she could imagine the ICJ ultimately ruling, yes, it is a genocide, and that, quote, what is happening in Gaza isn't all that far off from the historical archetype of genocide. Only Talmon was categorical to reject the genocide accusations. Quote, the evidence must be convincing, he says, and it is only convincing if it does not allow for another reasonable inference than genocidal intent. Ethnic cleansing, vengeance, and displacement, though, are other possible inferences from Israel's actions, all of them horrible enough, but not clear evidence of genocide. Der Spiegel, though, adds the note: Talmon is currently defending Myanmar at the ICJ from accusations of genocide by the Gambia. As such, Der Spiegel notes, quote, he has an interest in a narrow interpretation of the Genocide Convention, end quote. But German academia is not the only one that started openly discussing Israel's genocidal plans. Remember I told you to keep in mind Cheney and Cohen's 3 counter-arguments to genocide? Well, something interesting happened recently. Israel's latest plans are to build the so-called humanitarian city in the southern coast of Gaza, the ghetto I described before. People will go into this ghetto and will never be allowed to leave again. Their entire lives will be controlled by the army that keeps them trapped. Well, on July 10, 2025, 16 Israeli scholars of international law wrote a letter to their government warning that these plans would be unlawful under international law. Yuval Cheney was among the signatories. So was Eyal Benvenisti, a former member of Israel's defense team at the ICJ. The letter states that, quote, if implemented, the plan would constitute a series of war crimes and crimes against humanity and under certain conditions could amount to the crime of genocide. Importantly, the letter concludes that the plans, quote, may be interpreted as the deliberate infliction on the group of conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, a conduct which falls under the prohibition of genocide. Several ministers and MKs have made statements that may be interpreted as expressing such intent. The letter, though, is weirdly phrased in the future tense, as if it is only as of July 10, 2025, or only after the plans for establishing a ghetto in Gaza are realized that Israel's genocide will become undeniable. No doubt this is trying to hedge comments like Cheney's from 2024 to try and convey a narrative where before there could be doubt, but not after these plans are put in practice. This seems like a pretty big internal contradiction in the letter, though. If Israel's future plans are genocidal, then Israel is currently displaying genocidal intent, which means Israel's current actions would be genocidal. Not in the future, but now. So we have sort of come full circle to the point where not even Israel's former defenders can defend them any longer. Which is why I say that the consensus in international law is also that Israel is committing genocide. In this video, I have tried to share a fair retelling of how the academic consensus on the Israeli genocide of Gaza took and continues to take shape. How the disciplines of genocide studies and international law approached the situation, the internal discussions they had, and the underlying assumptions that influenced each scholar's conclusions. We are now at the stage where members of Israel's own legal team are telling you this is a genocidal state. I really do not have any doubts about what is the overwhelming conclusion of academia right now. I guess the main frustration I have with this is how this vast amount of academic production remained consistently excluded from mainstream discussions. Most of the shift in the Gaza genocide discourse occurred in complete isolation from these academic debates. In fact, the key turning point, as I've said, was that Dave Smith and Douglas Murray debate on Joe Rogan. Ironically, a debate where Murray demanded deference for his views on account of an expertise he claims but does not have. He's neither a scholar of genocide or of international law. And where Smith argued his non-expert views were more reasonable because they were more human. International law, in fact, Smith has said before, in a debate with John Spencer no less, is inhumane and unconcerned with human suffering.
You missed my entire point. Once you're appealing to the law or appealing to how warfare actually works, you're missing the entire point that I was making. My point is that this is not how the law works, and this is not how war actually works. I'm making a much more basic human point, a fundamental point. Look, Pierce, the other day, okay, this is, and by the way, if you don't want to believe this story, it's fine. It's just one firsthand account from Gaza. But whether it's true or not, and there's no reason to suspect it's not true, but whether it's true or not, there's just been hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of examples like this. But so there was a woman, a building collapsed. She says, as she's walking down the building, she can hear the little kids, not 16-year-old members of Hamas. You're talking 4- and 5-year-olds screaming for their mothers while they're buried underneath the rubble, screaming for help from their mommy. And you know what, Pierce? No help is coming because there's no bulldozers in Gaza. Nobody's coming to get those kids out. This is the reality of war. And this is what I'm trying, this is the main point that I was trying to make to Douglas Murray, which he kept running away from. If you're going to say that our goal here is to degrade Hamas, Murray conceded you probably can't eliminate them, but he feels like you can degrade them. If you're going to degrade Hamas and the cost of it is those little children dying under rubble, screaming for their mother as their bones are crushed and no one's coming to help them, then fine. But at least say that you find that price acceptable. And then we could have a real conversation about why people are going to view you as a monster and why the other side will never stop fighting and will always be against you. Because I could tell you for sure, if that was my kids, and I know, Pierce, if those were your kids as well, you wouldn't want to hear anything about how, well, we've codified in international law that this is the norm of the way wars are allowed to be fought versus not allowed to be fought. I'm making a very human point that this is the reality of war. And you can say under international humanitarian law, it's not considered intentional. We would consider this an intentional act in any other area. That's the point. It's a very basic human point that if anyone were to do this domestically and then tried to use the defense of like, no, but I dropped a leaflet. No, I didn't really want to kill them. I just wanted to kill them. We'd go, I don't care. You blew up a building knowing there were kids in there. That's the essence of this whole thing. And there's no amount, like, there's no amount of expertise that can really get you away from this basic fundamental moral logic.
But nothing was farther from the truth. Smith simply was discussing with someone whose underlying assumptions represent a very specific slice of international legal academia. From the perspective of academia, this experience has been incredibly frustrating. Not because I believe that only people with PhDs should be allowed to speak. Far from it. As I've said before, we need diversity of ideas. PhDs, academics, politicians, activists, pundits, vloggers, comedians, they all play their part. But the reality is that right now academia plays no part. And this is just mind-boggling to me. I just don't understand it. So I hope with this video I can help paint a more thorough picture of the academic discussion and give you new tools with which to process this ongoing genocide. So let me know if you have any questions, and please don't forget to subscribe and like. See you next time.